Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar, which is all about navigating transitioning back to the office and attendance avoidance. To get us started, I'll quickly run through a little bit of housekeeping first, just so you know how everything works during today's session. On the current slide, you'll see some controls, and they're going to appear down the right-hand side of your screen. You'll notice that your microphone icon is red. That just means that it's muted automatically. You can't actually unmute yourself, so don't worry about any background noise coming through from your end. If you click on the speech bubble with the question mark, you've got a Q&A panel. You can type any questions in there at any time during the session. Just a quick tip on that, you can't actually save the Q&A, so if you do want to make a note of any answers, then just copy and paste them into a Word document. I have provided a couple of handouts for you today, so there is a full colour version that will have any clickable links on there, and there will be a black and white printer-friendly version of today's slides. And you can download these by clicking on the little paper icon that is just below the Q&A panel. And if you would like a closer look at any of the slides today, you can switch to full screen mode just by clicking on those 4 arrows icon at the bottom of the screen. And to get back to normal, you can just click them again. So that is everything you need to know. Now let's meet our speakers. So I'm Sarah, I'm a learning facilitator here at Sage, and I'm joined today by Advisor Plus HR Technical Associate Jack Jones and Senior HR Advisor Katie Rees to share their expertise on the shift from home working and returning your employees to office working successfully. Jack, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you. So hi, my name is Jack. I've worked in HR for over 7 years, working mainly supporting large organisations in industries such as the UK holiday homes and resorts, aviation, utilities and plumbing, heating and renewable energy. I've completed levels 3 and 5 CIPD qualifications, and I've worked at Advisor Plus for 2.5 years. My role as HR Technical Associate means I get to work closely with our clients and advisory team, as well as sharing opportunity to work on a variety of HR consultancy projects. I have experience working on complex HR topics such as grievance, disciplinary, capability, flexible working, and many others. Katie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Jack. I've worked in HR and employment law for 25 years now, and I've been an advisor with Advisor Plus for just over 3 years. And that's been supporting customers with their EI issues and coaching managers of our customers. So before this, I've worked in private practice, I've worked in-house and for consultancies, and that's been providing advice, consultancy services, and as a litigator, representing clients in mediations, arbitrations, at early conciliation, and in the employment tribunals and the employment appeal tribunal. I've also delivered training, mock tribunals, and legal updates.
Perfect, thank you both so much for that introduction. Now let's take a look at what we'll be covering today. So we'll start off by setting the scene. So why returning to the office became challenging and what has changed since the pandemic. We'll then take a look at home versus office working. So we'll look at some key advantages, disadvantages, and the rise of attendance avoidance as well. We'll then move on to look at some employer responsibilities, so contracts, flexible working, any legal risks and how you can support well-being. We'll look at managing the return to the office, so communication strategies, hybrid models, incentives, and how to handle refusal or grievances. We'll then finish off by looking at some real-world examples and some Q&A time as well. So we'll make sure that at the end of the webinar, you can access the slides we've used throughout the webinar. We will share the webinar recording as well, just so you can watch back on demand. And of course, we will share any links to the portal of any policies and areas you might need to pay particular attention to. But I'll share a little bit more on how to access these at the end of the session. But with that said, let's get going. So to set the scene, how did getting people to work in the office become problematic in the first place?
So for those who may not have attended the last webinar on flexible working, I'm going to summarise some of the key points on this. So prior to the COVID-19 pandemic in 2019, early 2020, working flexibly was largely uncommon for most organisations, with only around 5% of the workforce in the country working from home. During lockdown, businesses needed to find ways in which their employees could work more flexibly, and in most cases, this meant a lot of employees beginning to work from home. After lockdown, many employees wanted to retain that flexibility, and some organisations did find it beneficial in some ways, such as being able to downgrade the size of their offices or keeping their employees permanently working from home as a cost saving. Whereas other organisations found that flexible working didn't work for them for various reasons, and they are now looking to return employees back into the office. While the reasons for requesting a return to the office are varied, a significant consideration in most cases is the desire to bring teams together to increase creativity, collaboration, as well as supporting employees at the early stages of their careers. However, various surveys in this area demonstrate that staff like flexibility and hybrid working and have no desire to return to the office full-time. Some employees even go as far as saying that they would quit their job if they had to return to the office permanently. Employers who feel that a return to the office will be beneficial to the organisation, reluctance from employees can be tricky to navigate. If an employee has been performing their job from home since the pandemic, it may be difficult to persuade them that coming back to the office is better for them and/or for the business. Insisting that an employee returns to the office can lead to workplace conflicts, and we would advise that the request needs to be handled carefully.
Are there any benefits of working at home in comparison to being in the office? And what are the disadvantages that businesses might need to overcome?
Sure, so let's go through some advantages. So these can include improved work-life balance and flexibility, so customized schedules and being able to manage personal commitments. There's time and cost savings, so eliminating that daily commute and reducing spend on fuel. A customizable environment, so employees can create a comfortable, personalized workspace. And increased job satisfaction through that increased autonomy. The disadvantages, on the other hand, and reasons why employers are looking to get it back into office working, is through isolation and mental health. So that lack of in-person social interaction, which can lead to feelings of loneliness and a reduced sense of belonging. Blurred work-life boundaries, so it's more challenging to switch off, and that leads to overworking. So for example, if you know your laptop is only in the next room, you might log on for a quick 5 minutes. Limited access to resources and tech issues, so remote workers may lack high-speed internet or specialised equipment. How often is it that you hear somebody say that their internet is slow or it's dropped off? Most managers in that scenario would request that that colleague then work from the office anyway. And security risks, so home networks may not be at the same level of security as corporate systems. I'm sure we've all heard about the big cyber attacks in recent years. In 2025 in the UK, remote and hybrid work environments remain a major target. 41% of cyber attacks in the UK targeted remote workers, and 29% of businesses reported breaches that were linked to home networks. That is approximately 612,000 UK businesses that suffered from a cyber attack, and the average cost exceeding £10,000.
So we mentioned attendance avoidance at the start of the webinar. What exactly is this?
Okay, so attendance avoidance in this context refers to various ways employees resist employer-mandated in-person office attendance requirements. Attendance avoidance has become common in most post-pandemic landscapes for several reasons, such as financial and time cost of commuting. So employees value time saved from not travelling, and increased fuel, parking and public transport costs can make commuting undesirable. The desire for autonomy and flexibility, so employees have grown accustomed to managing their own schedules, and the ability to handle matters without strict office hours is highly valued. Reduced productivity in the office, so many employees feel that they are more productive at home by not having distractions such as chatty co-workers and a lack of private space. And health and well-being concerns, so the anxiety that's associated around that return to the office. And these are just to name a few. There can also be many reasons that tie in with being a working parent and/or health condition related.
That's really helpful, thanks. Although there are some real benefits to working in the office, it does sound like some employees might struggle with this a little bit more than others. What might they look to do about it, and what should employers do about it?
Some employees in reality may feel quite strongly about wanting to work at home, despite the business's best efforts to persuade them otherwise, and they might still take a really hard line and decline to come into the office if they don't have to contractually. So we've had many businesses over recent years who've had employees ask do I have to, or even you can't make me. So the questions are, so do they and can we? So for both employers and employees, it can therefore be really helpful to be really clear about what the terms are about this situation in their contract of employment. And this is a good starting point from which also to look at any situation of this type, so that the person handling the issue on the employer's side can be as clear as they can about what has been agreed between them and the employee at the outset of their employment to start off with. So it can be good to remind employees of the bottom line in terms of what their contract provides, even if there's more of an appetite for negotiation and compromise, so that at least they appreciate their own position on this. Now, your starting point would be to see if the contract of employment specified that the individual's place of work is at a specific office. So if your business works from multiple sites, you would check which site is stipulated in that person's contract of employment, and you should also check to see if their contract has been changed at any point since they started. And sometimes, in reality, there are lots of variations, and this might need a little bit of working and picking through. Now, by law, in an ideal world, every single variation would have been agreed in writing and attached to the original contract, or the original contract amended and be signed by both parties. Now, the reality is, of course, that quite often arrangements are made without that underlying contract being actually amended. Now, even if an amendment is simply agreed in an email, something in writing is still really helpful, and it's an advantage as there's less room for interpretation. So do keep a lookout for any documents at all that might accompany a contract of employment, as you'll need to consider the impact that those have too. Now, if a change has been agreed outside the contract of employment, such as an email or other kind of written exchange, even messages, you might need to consider, is this a fundamental contract term change, either on a permanent basis or on a temporary basis? Or if it was just a local agreement on a very temporary basis indeed. So, for example, during COVID, a lot of employees made clear that they wanted to work from home to stay safe, and employers made that conditional. And that definitely implies the right to revert back. But if you're not sure as to whether any informal changes can actually be enforced, please do seek advice and guidance on this before taking any steps on an individual case. Now, if a permanent variation for working at home was agreed, then there isn't any right to bring somebody back. If the business need has changed, though, then you could still consult about this, just like you would in any reorganisation or restructure situation. I won't get that into too much detail here because that's quite a subject in itself. Now, variations to contract can also be made orally. So despite there being a requirement for an employer to put any contract variation or term in writing, if it hasn't happened, it doesn't mean that change isn't still valid. It may just make it harder to define what it was, and there may be different interpretations by the employee on the one hand and the employer on the other hand. So there is more risk in trying to enforce something that isn't in writing, and for that reason we would always encourage you to make sure that any changes are actually written down and recorded. Now, if the current situation has been negotiated orally rather than in writing, you might need to sit down and look at exactly what was arranged and when, to consider if this was something permanent or contractually just temporary. Now, if an employer takes a view that an employee doesn't have the contractual entitlement to work from home, and they still want to look to enforce that return, but the employee still doesn't want to, then it's a good idea to ask the employee if they would like to formalise a flexible working request. Now, even if they don't use that language, that is likely what they are seeking in reality. So channeling them into that process is the best for reducing risk on the part of the employer, and also to say it's not true that you haven't even considered any request, if that's suggested. Now, we did have that webinar last month that Jack's referred to, and we covered that whole process in some detail, along with some nuances and some factors to consider. So we don't want to repeat all of that here, but do please go back and take a look if you want to find out more about that flexible working process. Now, one thing it's worth noting is that putting in place a hybrid working policy can be a really helpful way to manage a hybrid working approach that a business might want to take. Now, if the reality is that we are offering or want to offer without the need for individuals to make their own requests, that's where it's a good idea. Now, we discussed in the last webinar that having a hybrid working policy doesn't extinguish an employee's rights or their ability to still make a flexible working request to work at home. So again, I won't repeat that in here, but we do touch and overlap on that quite a lot in that last webinar recording. Now, once you've gone through any flexible working application process and the answer is given once and for all, subject, of course, to the right to appeal, which does apply, then enforcement is an option if the employee still refuses to comply. Now, that can involve the employer giving notice of the date of when they want that employee to attend back at work, and also the warning of the potential disciplinary consequences for failing to do so. And then after that, any failure can be dealt with through the standard investigation and disciplinary stages like you would with any misconduct. Now, because how someone feels about returning to the office is a much bigger issue than purely the contractual position, the best approach is to look to soften that blow where at all possible. So there is an implied term worth thinking about of trust and confidence in every employment relationship, so you'll want to tread carefully and be diplomatic so far as you possibly can. Now, employment tribunals recognise that sometimes it is quite an upheaval for an employee when looking at how a process was handled, if there's a claim for constructive dismissal, for an example. So allowing a phased return back can be a big help and also an incentive to employees, as can making any tweaks around the edges where possible, just to address those individual concerns that they might have. Now, if someone's concern is the commute, for example, at rush hour, then you might want to look at how some changes can be agreed to change their travel times, for example, maybe their start at work times. Now, most employers are reasonable, so employees should be willing to express exactly what their concern or their issue is, so that the employer can go away and look at solutions, even incentives. Now, if a particular situation is likely to get contentious, then whilst you might not be obliged to agree to particular requests that an employee might have, if it will seal the deal to get some movement at least from them on the issue, then that quite often can be a really effective route.
Great, thanks so much for that, Katie. So that sounds like it might be helpful for some employees, like working parents or those who have caring responsibilities, but what about those with health conditions?
Yeah, thank you. We talked in the webinar again on flexible working about there being different tests in law for a flexible working application being considered compared to the obligation to make reasonable adjustments on health grounds. Now, when considering whether an employee has a disability, and if that disability therefore has any limitation impacts on them returning, please be aware that under the Equality Act, somebody has a disability if they have a condition that has lasted or is likely to last for a year or more and has a significant impact on the person. Now, if they do have a possible disability, reasonable adjustments need to be made. So if the condition doesn't necessarily reach that disability threshold, but it's still a genuine medical reason, so for example, someone has a broken leg, they can't get to work, that reasonableness test still needs to be applied on top of all of that. Now, this obligation under the Equality Act or otherwise, it's only for so long as that's medically required, and it's significant that that doesn't extend simply to employee preference. Now, you'd want to explore exactly why somebody is saying they can't work in the office if they feel that way, and if necessary, you can seek medical advice. It's ultimately the employer's decision as to what's reasonable. Now, you do need to consider an employee's personal circumstances and accommodate them wherever possible, but there is no actual right to work at home per se. Now, sometimes an employee might make a personal arrangement that limits their ability to attend work without even having got their employer's agreement. So, for example, in a recent case, an employee had got 4 husky dogs that couldn't possibly be left alone during the day, and that was basically their reason for refusing to attend. So that person really should have talked to their employer to discuss it before getting those dogs, knowing full well that they were going to be severely limiting their ability to come back to work. And then after making arrangements, dog daycare, for example, something might have been worked out or it might not have, but each case has to be looked at on its own merits. Now, that employee probably would have made a flexible working request, and the employer would therefore need to have had really significant, clear business grounds for not agreeing to home working. Now, in another case, for example, one person moved to the countryside about 2.5 hours from their employer, again on the assumption that he was entitled to do so and that working from home was actually permanent. Now, he took a big risk in doing that without talking to his employers first, of course. Likewise, some people have taken to caring for children or maybe elderly relatives in their working hours. So employers can remember that there's a good faith term implied into all contracts of employment, and usually a clause meaning that someone must dedicate all reasonable time and effort in their working hours to their work. So for employees with childcare or other requirements outside of working hours, but still limiting their ability to travel to an extent, then ways to work with them do need to be looked at in the first instance. For example, can they alter their start or finish times, or the days that they're needed to be in office to support with things like school pickups and drop-offs.
So if employers don't consider these things, what might the repercussions be?
So there are discrimination risks, so around disability, sex, age, etc. So employment tribunal claims if denying an employee to return to work from home for discriminatory factors could lead to a claim resulting in compensation. There's also unfair dismissal and detriment. So if an employee is fired or unfairly treated for requesting to work from home, for example, as a reasonable adjustment for a long-standing underlying health condition or disability, this could be classed as automatically unfair. Penalties for failing to comply with flexible working legislation. So these are things such as order of reconsideration, so forcing the employer to reevaluate. Awarding compensation, the employer pays up to a maximum of 8 weeks' pay, capped at the statutory maximum rate, which is £179 per week from the 6th of April 2025. Or order to follow a procedure, so the employer returns to complete the consultation process properly. There are also resignation risks, so this aligns with constructive dismissal. So strong, fair processes are required to reduce the risks of these. Constructive unfair dismissal. So working from home was an express or an implied term, and removing it could lead to employees resigning and claiming constructive dismissal. There are also health and safety claims, so employees who have a disability or a long-term underlying health condition where it is essential for them to work from home, refusing this could lead to legal action. There's also breach of contract. So by changing working conditions without consent could be considered as a breach of contract.
Great, thanks so much for that, Jack. So if any of our attendees today are looking at getting their teams back into the office, what can they do now to make sure that they can support their employees and get the right results?
Sure, so employees need to know what is expected of them and in good time so that they can make alternative arrangements well in advance if they need to. Here are some ways that businesses can set up for success. So communicate with transparency, lead by example. Managers must be visible in the office so that they can model the desired behaviour. Being transparent, so businesses should explain how in-office policies supports them and their employees. And continuous feedback, so use things like surveys and refining their policies. Implement flexibility. So we talked about hybrid models. According to the CIPD, 74% of organisations say they have hybrid working in place in 2025. This decreased from 84% in a similar survey by the CIPD in 2023. Gradual re-entry, so start with a phased return approach. You might want to incentivise the return through food and perks, commuter benefits, or even social events. Once employees are back in the office, businesses will need to consider how to identify warning signs, so watch for patterns of absence or disengagement and address them sensitively. And check-ins, so managers and leaders should schedule regular one-to-one meetings to gauge employees' wellbeing and offer support where required. Wellbeing support, so utilise available mental health resources, employee assistance programs, etc. And maybe use personal action plans. So each employee creates a short plan outlining the steps that they will take to support not only themselves, but and others.
That's great, thanks, Jack. So that's really some great advice. Thank you both. Do you have any advice as to what employers can do when they've taken all of these steps and they still can't get employees back into work?
Thanks, I'll look at that. So if an employee refuses to return to the office from home, employers should handle the situation through a structured and fair process, as it would generally be treated as failure to follow reasonable management instruction. Cases could lead to claims of unfair dismissal or discrimination if that measured approach wasn't taken. So that's really crucial. So I just want to give a summarised breakdown as to how to manage that situation based on HR best practices and UK employment law. So the first point would be the initial investigation and the communication around that. So check the employee's contract, see if it stipulates a location. Then initiate a conversation. So managers can reach out to the employee to understand the reasons for not returning, for example. Is it due to caring responsibilities, health concerns, safety worries, etc.? Then check health and safety and welfare. So if an employee refuses to return due to safety concerns, for example, they might think they would be put in danger. You can't legally discipline or dismiss them for this, providing their belief is reasonable. And then document everything. So ensure to keep records of all conversations, meetings, emails, etc. Now, the second part of any process would be handling reasonable accommodations. So factors would be consider flexible working requests, as discussed. Bear in mind that legislation changed as of April 24, where employees now have a day one right to request flexible working. You would then identify any protected characteristics. So forcing a return to the office could constitute indirect discrimination, for example, against women who, due to childcare or disabled employees' health risks, don't feel able to. Now, the next point would be formalising that return. So provide that notice. It needs to be reasonable, enough for them to return to the office, and that's a requirement. You would then have really clear policies and ensure that they're equally communicated clearly. And then finally, progressive discipline. Now, if the refusal continues. So generally speaking, we start off with an informal warning. This is where managers can express their concerns and explain the consequences of a failure to return. Secondly, if the attendance avoidance refuses, they refuse, it persists, the situation continues, appoint an independent manager to investigate again why. Now, this could then lead to a disciplinary hearing where a warning is issued. However, alternatives at every stage should be explored, such as a temporary hybrid working relationship or even a change in the contract. Now, Jack, what about what happens if a grievance is raised?
Sure. So if an employee raises a formal grievance, and let's just say, for example, they also go off sick absent, this requires a sensitive, legally compliant and empathetic approach to avoid claims of constructive dismissal or discrimination. So I'm going to give a summarised breakdown of how to manage this situation based on HR best practices and UK employment law. If an employee raises a grievance and then goes on sick leave, an employer should not delay and handle the case promptly. Managers should maintain regular contact from a wellbeing and case update perspective and request permission to obtain a report from that employee's GP or occupational health. If the grievance that they've raised is centred around the return to the office, that manager should review contracts to check if it was ever formally changed at any stage to see if it allows for management discretion on location. Engage with the employee to discuss concerns and potential compromises. And if the employee believes the return poses serious and imminent danger, they may have the right to refuse. Now, next steps for employees handling this grievance. They should look to appoint an independent, impartial manager to investigate. Consideration should be given to adjust the process if the employee is too unwell to attend a face-to-face meeting. So, for example, could offer a video call or a written submission. You would want to look to document everything, so keeping full records of meetings, emails, etc. And consider mediation if the dispute is interpersonal. If an employee remains sick absent, you would continue to manage the absence through occupational health, welfare and absence meetings, and consider reasonable adjustments where appropriate to help enable a return to work. If you're ever unsure, you can always give the advice line a call and speak to one of our advisors.
That's great. Thanks so much for that, Jack. So we are seeing a lot about this topic in the news at the moment. So with some employers getting this right and some getting it really wrong. Do you have any examples of where getting people back into the office has worked and where it hasn't?
Sure. So the People Management magazine has reported on HSBC considering a return to the office mandate where employees would be required to be on site at least 3 days per week. So their former chief executive, Noel Quinn, had previously advocated for a hybrid structure as it's always allowed the company to cut their global office costs by 40%. However, the bank could face a shortfall in desks because they've moved their UK headquarters from a smaller office from Canary Wharf to St Paul's, and they could result a shortfall of desks of 7,700. So this is an example where, despite the rush to implement a return to the office mandate, some businesses are failing to ensure adequate office facilities are in place ahead of their workers' return. And this therefore can set them up for resistance, resulting in that attendance avoidance that we've been referring to.
Thanks, Jack. And another example, the BBC reported on Amazon ordering staff back to the office 5 days a week as the business ended its hybrid working policy. Now, that change came into force in January 2025 after Amazon's chief exec, Andy Jassy, sent a memo to staff saying, "We've decided that we're going to return being in the office like we were before the onset of COVID." And he added that it would help staff be better set up to invent, collaborate, and be connected enough to each other. Now, Amazon's push to get staff back into the office has been a source of a bit of tension within that firm, which employs more than 1.5 million people globally on a full and part-time basis.
That's great. Thanks for that, Katie. So that is some great information that you have shared, and thank you both for sharing your thoughts with us today. So following on from this, we've had a few questions come through. So before we wrap the webinar up, let's go through a few of these together. So first question we have had is, should employers mandate a full return or offer flexibility?
I don't mind taking this one. So I'd suggest that flexibility works best for most organisations. So we've touched on hybrid models during the webinar today. So that's 2 to 3 days in the office. We tend to see higher compliance, staff morale and retention to strict mandates for these. So flexibility works best.
Perfect, that's great. Thanks, Jack. So next question that we've had come through, we've got, how important is leadership behaviour in this transition?
I'll take that one, thanks. And the answer would be very. So employees are far more likely to return if their leaders are visible in the office and actively participate. So if leadership stays remote, those mandates may feel just unfair and disengaging.
That's great. Thanks for that, Katie. Another question. So we've got, what if some employees still refuse to return?
I don't mind taking this one. So you would handle it on a case-by-case basis. Some roles may remain remote, others may require office presence. So employers would need to be clear about expectations. They would also need to assess performance outcomes rather than focusing solely on location.
That's great. Thanks, Jack. And I think we've got time for one more. So that is, how long should employers expect the transition to take?
Thanks, I'll take that one. The answer really would be several months. It's not quick because gradual rollouts work much better than abrupt changes, and trial periods also help test out what works before maybe finalising those policies.
That's great. Thank you, Katie. And thank you very much for those questions. We hope you have found it a valuable session today. And if we weren't able to cover off your questions, we will be following up with you personally after the session. So don't worry if you haven't had your question answered. Jack and Katie, thank you both for your insight and practical guidance today as well. So a few things I want to cover before we finish. If you'd like our help with anything we've covered, please feel free to check out any of the topics covered in the Sage HR advice portal, or alternatively, if you are a professional or premium customer, please do not hesitate to call the advice line, where one of our consultants will happily provide any guidance on the topic covered today. I am going to be running a poll shortly just to offer you the chance to hear more about these products. There is no obligation with this, obviously, but with the ever-changing world, it might be something you are keen to look at in a little bit more detail. So with that said, I will pop the poll up on screen now. I'll give you around 45 seconds to a minute just to pop that in if you are wanting to know more information. I can see some coming through there. I'll leave that open for about 10 more seconds just in case anyone else wants to get that submitted. Fab. I will go ahead and close that down now. I do just want to let you know as well, alongside Sage Payroll, we do offer other people solutions, so Sage HR and HR Advice. So Sage HR enables you to automate and simplify your HR tasks, ensuring you manage your employees fairly and consistently, supporting your productivity, well-being and job satisfaction within your workplace. You can also trust that with Sage HR Advice, you'll remain up to date with latest employment law, HR, health and safety legislation, supporting your business work within legal frameworks and reducing the risk of any tribunals and penalties. And lastly, we do run regular webinars every week on Sage 50 Payroll and Accounts. Our next webinar in partnership with Advisor Plus is on the Employment's Right Bill Explained. So what's new and what to do. And that one's at the 4th of March at 11 AM. If you would also like more information or a free demo on our Sage HR software, you will receive a follow-up email with more info on how to get in touch as well. Now, just before we bring the webinar to a close, I do have one quick favour to ask you all. If you do have a couple of minutes to fill out a survey. Now, this is around business-related, non-Sage product learning. It would really be appreciated. So you can do so by scanning the QR code or clicking the link on your handout. This feedback is going to be used to inform our roadmap for content, so your input is really valuable to us. So I will leave that up just for 30 seconds or so before we wrap up. So if you do have 2 seconds to fill that out, if you do have the handouts downloaded, it will be on there as well. So that does bring us to the end of today's webinar. Thank you very much to Katie and Jack for speaking as well. If you please can complete our survey on the webinar today as well. We do rely on your comments and questions as to what we are going to showcase next. So we do really read every comment, and it does take a couple minutes of your time to complete. So if you do have 2 seconds to fill that out, that would be much appreciated. But from me, Katie and Jack, thank you very much for joining us today, and hopefully we'll see you on the next one, but it is goodbye for now.
Bye.